At the engagement banquet, my fiancé's first love, who had died, came back to life, holding his hand and whispering, "A qualified substitute should voluntarily disappear when the real one returns." I thought she was right. I turned around and jumped from the third-floor banquet hall, crashing into the fountain at the hotel entrance. The Zhou and Bai families were terrified and hurriedly sent me to the hospital. My fiancé stayed by the bedside, warning me not to use such tactics to gain sympathy. I nodded obediently, and in the dead of night, I pulled out my own ventilator, causing the electrocardiogram to flatline instantly. Since she's back, I'll return this life to her as well. Wishing you 100 years of happiness. Later, I was revived, and his first love deliberately spilled hot water on me in the ward. But I didn't dodge, just letting the boiling water pour over my arm, causing the skin to quickly swell and blister. She panicked and tried to cover it up for me. "You lunatic, if Ryan finds out, he'll think I'm vicious. Don't you feel pain?" What she didn't know was that I had resisted before, but it only led to them jointly torturing me to death. This time I decided to make them owe me a life. I fell from the third floor into the fountain, and the icy water enveloped me instantly. Before my consciousness blurred, I saw Ryan's usually composed face show terror and panic for the first time. He rushed out of the hotel entrance, followed by Vivian, who should have died of heart disease 3 years ago. How wonderful. Being able to see them go crazy over me in person was worth breaking a few bones. When I woke up again, I was in the VIP ward. The pure white ceiling, the smell of disinfectant, and Ryan by the bedside with eyes full of gloom. Seeing me open my eyes, he showed no concern, only a bone-chilling warning. "Ariana, don't use such despicable tactics to gain sympathy or threaten me. Vivian has just returned and her body is weak, she can't handle your antics." His voice was pleasant, once my most soothing lullaby in the dead of night. But now, every word was like a poison needle piercing my heart. I blinked, as my vocal cords were damaged from the fall, rendering me unable to speak, so I could only nod obediently. He seemed satisfied with my compliance, his expression softening a bit as he got up to pour a glass of water. "The doctor said you only have minor fractures and soft tissue contusions, no life-threatening danger. Rest well, the Zhou family won't mistreat you." His tone of bestowal made it seem like I jumped from the third floor just to demand breakup compensation from him. I looked at him and forced a weak smile. He frowned, seeming unaccustomed to my appearance. In the dead of night, everyone had left. After the nurses' scheduled rounds, only the ticking of the instruments remained in the ward. I slowly raised my uninjured left hand toward the oxygen tube sustaining my breathing. Ryan was right, I shouldn't use such tactics to gain sympathy. I should die more thoroughly. The waveform on the cardiac monitor suddenly flattened, emitting a sharp, piercing alarm. The door was slammed open, and doctors and nurses swarmed in. Before completely losing consciousness, I seemed to see Ryan return, rushing to the bedside with an expression of near-collapse terror on his handsome face that I had never seen before. In my mind, I said my last words to him. "Ryan, since she's back, I'll return this life to her as well. Wishing you 100 years of happiness." I didn't die. Ryan spent a fortune to hire the best medical team, forcibly pulling me back from the gates of hell. He guarded me 24 hours a day, even moving his desk into the ward, never leaving my side. The elders from the Zhou family and people from the Bai family took turns visiting, each looking at me with complex and wary eyes. They probably all thought that this Ariana was truly an unmitigated lunatic. Vivian came on the third day after the tube-pulling incident. She wore a white dress, with delicate makeup that made her look pitiably fragile, carrying a thermos. "Ariana, I stewed some nourishing soup for you, have some." She dismissed the caregiver and personally served the soup, assuming a very humble posture. With Ryan absent, she didn't bother pretending anymore. She handed the scalding hot soup bowl to me, her eyes carrying a hint of glee and probing. "Ariana, stop pretending, I know you're doing all this on purpose. Jumping off the building, pulling the ventilator, do you really think this will keep Ryan?" I didn't speak, just quietly looking at her. She felt uneasy under my gaze, her hand holding the bowl trembling slightly. Why are you looking at me like that? Do you think I'm afraid of you? Let me tell you, 3 years ago, if it weren't for me. Before she finished, her wrist suddenly accidentally tilted, spilling the entire bowl of scalding ginseng soup onto my plastered arm and the surrounding skin. The moment the boiling water touched my skin, intense burning pain surged through me. Yet, I didn't even furrow my brow, even curling my lips slightly at her. Vivian was completely stunned. She had anticipated me screaming, crying, or angrily accusing her. The only reaction she hadn't expected was this one. The skin swelled and blistered at a visible rate, and the air filled with the aroma of ginseng soup mixed with the scorched smell of burned flesh. She finally snapped out of her shock, panicking as she rushed over, wanting to wipe it with tissues but afraid to touch my horrific wound. Lunatic. You're a lunatic. She lowered her voice, with a sobbing tone. If Ryan finds out, he'll think I'm vicious. She frantically tried to clean up the spilled soup bowl and the mess on the floor, attempting to destroy the evidence. Don't you feel pain? Why don't you cry out in pain? Watching her in disarray, I finally spoke, my voice extremely hoarse. Why should I cry out? Isn't this what you wanted to see? She didn't know that in my previous life, I had screamed in agony until my voice broke. When she and Ryan teamed up, tying me to the operating table, preparing to harvest my heart while I was alive. I cried and begged them, screaming until my vocal cords tore, but they just indifferently covered my mouth. Ryan said, Ariana, stop shouting. Being able to exchange your heart for Vivian's life is your blessing. So this time I wouldn't shout anymore. I wanted them to personally push me into the abyss and spend the rest of their lives in repentance. At that moment, the ward door was pushed open. Ryan stood at the doorway with a file bag, his face grim as he looked at everything before him, the soup stains on the floor, the gruesome blisters on my arm, and Vivian's face full of terror and guilt. The air seemed to freeze. Vivian's body stiffened, her face instantly turning as pale as paper. Ryan, I didn't mean to, the soup was too hot, and my hand slipped accidentally. She explained incoherently, tears falling like broken pearls. Ryan's gaze shifted from her to my burned arm, his pupils contracting sharply. He strode over, shoving Vivian aside, nervously examining my injury. What happened? How did it get burned like this? He turned his head, roaring at the bodyguard at the door, Where's the doctor? Call the doctor over. The entire ward descended into chaos due to his fury. The doctors and nurses arrived quickly, carefully treating my wound. Vivian stood aside, crying pitifully, her body swaying as if she had suffered a great injustice. Ryan, it really wasn't me, it was her, she did it herself. Ryan turned sharply, his eyes cold as ice. She poured boiling water on herself? Vivian, do you take me for a fool? Vivian was stunned by his roar, her crying stopping as she looked at him in disbelief. I was also somewhat surprised. In my previous life, no matter what Vivian did, Ryan would unconditionally believe her. Even if she pointed at a deer and called it a horse, he would agree. This time, he actually yelled at his regained first love for my sake. Perhaps the impact of jumping from the 3rd floor was greater than I imagined. The doctor treated my wound, applied ointment, and rebandaged it with gauze. Throughout the process, I didn't make a sound. The more I remained silent, the uglier Ryan's expression became. After the doctors and nurses left, only the 3 of us remained in the ward. Ryan pulled over a chair, sat by my bed, his voice suppressing a storm. Ariana, tell me what exactly happened. I raised my eyes, looking past him to Vivian's ashen face behind him, then gently shook my head. It's not her fault, I was careless myself. My voice was still hoarse but clearly reached their ears. Vivian sighed in relief, giving me a grateful look. Ryan's brows furrowed even tighter. You were careless? He obviously didn't believe it. How could an entire bowl of hot soup accidentally spill all over yourself, and you didn't make a sound? I lowered my eyelashes and softly said, it hurt too much, I forgot to cry out. This sentence changed both Ryan and Vivian's expressions simultaneously. Ryan's eyes held deep pain and self-blame, while Vivian's were pure fear. What else could a person who didn't even feel pain from boiling water burns do? Ryan, don't listen to her nonsense, she's doing it on purpose. She wants to frame me. Vivian finally couldn't hold back and screamed. Ryan stood up abruptly, showing impatience toward her for the first time. You go back first, I'll handle this here. I'm not leaving. Ryan, you can't be deceived by her. This woman is too scheming. Get out. Ryan roared, and Vivian was completely dumbfounded. With tears in her eyes, she glared at me venomously, turned, and ran out. The ward finally quieted down. Ryan sat down again, silent for a long time before reaching out, seeming to want to touch my bandaged arm but not daring to. Ariana, he said with difficulty, I'm sorry. This was the first time in 3 years he had said sorry to me. Looking at him, I suddenly found it somewhat amusing. In my previous life, when he personally removed my heart from my chest, he didn't say a single sorry. Now, just because I was burned, he started feeling guilty? Human nature is truly laughable. Ryan, I looked into his eyes and asked word by word, if I say she did it on purpose, would you believe me? Ryan's body stiffened. He looked at me, his eyes full of struggle and pain. This question was like a knife, forcing him into a corner. On one side was his regained, frail first love, on the other was his fiancé who had just jumped off a building for him, pulled her tube, gotten burned, and was in an extremely unstable mental state. Believing one meant hurting the other. Ariana, he ultimately chose to evade. Vivian, she's not that kind of person. She's just too afraid of losing me. I sneered inwardly. Indeed, it's easier to change rivers and mountains than one's nature. No matter what I did, in his heart, Vivian was always that pure and flawless first love, while I was forever the scheming, vicious woman. So, you still don't believe me? I stated this fact calmly. It's not that I don't believe you, he explained urgently, I just. Ariana, don't hurt yourself anymore, okay? Whatever you want, I'll give it to you, as long as you don't do anything foolish again. He held my hand, his palm scorching hot. We won't dissolve the engagement, you'll still be the Zhou family's prospective daughter-in-law. I'll take care of you for life, is that not enough? Looking at him, I suddenly felt very tired. In my previous life, I had begged humbly like this too. I pleaded with him not to abandon me, to see my 3 years of devotion. But he just coldly pushed me away, saying, Ariana, you're just a substitute, now that the real one is back, it's time for you to exit. Now, he was begging me instead. Truly, fortunes change. I gently withdrew my hand and shook my head. Ryan, you don't understand. What I wanted was never the status of a wife, nor your care. What I wanted was the life you owed me. My indifference and detachment made Ryan feel an unprecedented frustration. He stood up irritably, pacing back and forth in the ward. Ariana, what exactly do you want from me? Do you have to drive us all insane to be satisfied? I ignored him. I closed my eyes and began reviewing my next plan in my mind. Ryan's guilt was just the first step. What I wanted was for him to witness with his own eyes how his cherished first love gradually turned into a venomous woman. I wanted all his love to turn into blades, backfiring on himself. In the following days, Ryan hardly left my side. He personally fed me, wiped my body, and even after I fell asleep, he would repeatedly check my breathing. The more cautious he was, the more Vivian jealously went mad. She came every day, bringing different soups and supplements, performing scenes of deep affection with Ryan in front of me. And I remained the quiet, emotionless observer. Until the day I was discharged. Ryan handled all the procedures and prepared to take me back to our marital home. Vivian suddenly grabbed his arm, on the verge of tears. Ryan, I'm scared being home alone. Can you let Ariana stay somewhere else? Seeing her reminds me of that day. I'm really scared. She started using her best tactic of showing weakness to gain sympathy again. Ryan's face showed difficulty. I stood aside, watching coldly. In my previous life, it was like this. Because of Vivian's scared, he drove me out of our home and made me stay in a cold hotel. This time, I wanted to see how he would choose. Ryan was silent for a long time, long enough that Vivian's tears were almost dry. He finally spoke, "Vivian, Ariana's body hasn't recovered yet, she needs care. I'm not comfortable letting her stay alone." Vivian's face stiffened. Ryan continued, "How about this, you move in with me, and the two of you live together so I can take care of both at the same time." This proposal stunned both Vivian and me. Have her live with me? Was Ryan crazy? Vivian's face alternated between green and white, obviously unable to accept this arrangement. Living under the same roof with me, this lunatic, was no different from dancing with wolves. But Ryan's expression was firm, brooking no argument. "Ryan, you..." Vivian wanted to say something more. Ryan interrupted her, his tone carrying an undeniable firmness. "It's settled. Or, you go back to the Bai family, and I'll visit you every day." It was a choice between two options. Vivian knew clearly that once she returned to the Bai family, it would mean giving me and Ryan time alone. She bit her lip and finally nodded unwillingly. "Fine, I'll listen to you." I watched the undercurrents between them, my heart ice cold. "Ryan, do you think putting us both under your watch would allow you to control everything? You're wrong. You've just personally lit the fuse, detonating an even grander destruction." Returning to the marital home I had once carefully decorated, everything was as it was when I left. Except, the air now carried a hint of Vivian's perfume. She was already eager to claim sovereignty here. Ryan arranged me in the master bedroom and Vivian in the adjacent secondary bedroom. He seemed to want to prove my official status this way. Utterly ridiculous. That night, Ryan stayed at the company due to an emergency meeting. In the vast house, only Vivian and I remained. In the dead of night, I was awakened by a faint door-opening sound. I didn't move, maintaining steady breathing. In the darkness, a figure tiptoed to my bedside. It was Vivian. She held a pillow, her eyes flashing with venomous and mad light in the dark. I knew what she wanted to do. In my previous life, after I was driven out of home, she did the same, sneaking into my hotel room at night with a pillow. I closed my eyes, quietly awaiting that familiar suffocation. "Come on, Vivian. Let me see if this time you have the guts to kill me with your own hands in Ryan's home." The pillow came down with a whoosh, pressing firmly over my mouth and nose. The air was quickly deprived, and suffocation overwhelmed me like a tidal wave. I didn't struggle, letting her do as she pleased on my face. Vivian probably didn't expect me to be so cooperative. She paused, then increased the force. "Die. Ariana. Die. Once you're dead, Ryan will be mine alone." She whispered madly in my ear, her voice trembling with excitement. My consciousness began to fade, and tearing pain came from my lungs. Just as I thought I was really going to die by her hands again, the master bedroom door was suddenly slammed open from outside with great force. "Vivian! What are you doing?" It was Ryan's voice, full of shock, anger, and disbelief. Vivian was scared out of her wits, the pillow falling to the ground. She turned sharply, seeing Ryan at the door with a livid face, and was completely stunned. "Ryan, how did you come back?" Ryan didn't answer her. He rushed to the bedside in a few steps, seeing my purple face from holding breath and my dazed eyes. His heart felt like it was gripped tightly by an invisible hand. With trembling hands, he checked my breathing. Only after feeling that faint airflow did he relax as if exhausted. Immediately, overwhelming rage engulfed him. He turned abruptly and slapped Vivian hard across the face. The slap sound was particularly piercing in the quiet night. Vivian was knocked to the ground, blood seeping from the corner of her mouth. She covered her face, looking at Ryan in disbelief. You hit me? Ryan, you hit me for this, bitch? I'm hitting you, you venomous woman." Ryan's eyes were bloodshot, like an enraged lion. "I let you move in to take care of her, not to kill her." He pointed at the pillow on the ground, his voice trembling. you just wanted to kill her. This wasn't a question, it was an affirmation. Vivian's body shook like a sieve, she knew she could no longer quibble. For the first time, Ryan's eyes showed undisguised disgust and disappointment toward her. I didn't. I just saw her asleep and wanted to adjust her pillow. She was still making a last struggle. Adjust the pillow? Ryan laughed in anger. Who adjusts a pillow by pressing it on the face? Vivian, how long are you going to deceive me? I lay on the bed, gasping for fresh air, my chest heaving violently. Watching this dog-eat-dog farce before me, I felt no glee, only a dead silence and desolation in my heart. Ryan, now you know she's vicious? It's too late. In my previous life, you were her most capable accomplice. Ryan, listen to my explanation, it's her. She forced me. Vivian suddenly screamed like a madwoman, pointing at me. She's the lunatic. She deliberately jumped, pulled the tube, got burned by me on purpose, she just wants you to think I'm vicious, to drive a wedge between us. Her silence, her non-resistance, is the biggest scheme. Can't you see that? Ryan looked at me on the bed, weak as if I could shatter at any moment, then at the hysterical Vivian on the ground, the struggle in his eyes almost tore him apart. He closed his eyes in pain and waved his hand. Leave, Vivian. I don't want to see you anymore. I'm not leaving. Ryan, you can't treat me like this. Vivian lunged and hugged his leg. I waited for you for 3 years, I walked through the gates of hell for you. You can't abandon me for a substitute. Substitute? Ryan opened his eyes, his gaze terrifyingly cold. Who are you calling a substitute? Vivian was stunned. Ryan slowly squatted down and said clearly, word by word, Vivian, you've got one thing wrong. From beginning to end, Ariana was never your substitute. 3 years ago, I needed a heart source, a healthy one that matched me, to save your life. And Ariana was the most perfect vessel I found. Ryan's words exploded like a thunderbolt in the room. The color drained from Vivian's face, she stared at Ryan blankly, as if she didn't recognize him. I was also stunned. I thought Ryan was just madly in love with Vivian, which was why he did such cruel things to me in my previous life. I never thought that from the beginning, this was a thorough scam. I wasn't a substitute. I was just a walking, preparatory organ donor. Heart source, vessel. So, I wasn't even a person. I was just an object. A huge sense of absurdity and nausea surged up, and I couldn't help but dry heave. Ryan immediately looked over nervously, wanting to pat my back to soothe me. I swung his hand away fiercely, using all my strength to roar 2 words, "Don't touch." My reaction was so intense that Ryan was caught off guard, he froze in place, at a loss. Vivian on the ground finally recovered from the huge shock. She laughed, laughing maniacally, tears streaming down. Heart source, vessel, ha ha ha. Ryan, what a ruthless heart you have. She pointed at me, then at herself. So, all your kindness to her was to nurture this heart well? You feared her having accidents, her being unhealthy, her dying, all because of me? What am I to you? Love, or guilt? Ryan closed his eyes, his face full of pain. Both. Ha ha ha. Vivian laughed even harder. So, in your heart, I'm just a waste that needs someone else's heart to live, while she is the precious vessel you carefully protected. No wonder you went crazy when she jumped, when she pulled the tube, when she got burned. So you weren't heartbroken for her, you were heartbroken for your precious heart. Vivian's words were like sharp knives, peeling away Ryan's hypocritical mask layer by layer, revealing the ugliest, most selfish core underneath. Ryan's face was uglier than a dead man's. Enough, he roared. Vivian, I've done so much for you, even at the expense of hurting an innocent person. What more are you dissatisfied with? Dissatisfied? Vivian stood up, approaching him step by step. I'm very dissatisfied. Ryan, let me tell you, what I want is all of you. Your love, your guilt, everything. I don't want something taken from someone else. She turned sharply toward me, her eyes filled with world-destroying madness. Especially hers. I find it dirty. After saying that, she lunged at me like a madwoman. Since I can't have it, I'll destroy it. Let's see what you'll use to save your Vivian without this heart. Her target was my chest. Ryan reacted faster than her. Almost instinctively, he spread his arms and protected me tightly in his embrace. Vivian's sharp nails didn't reach me but left several deep bloody scratches on his back. Get out. Ryan held me and kicked Vivian in the stomach. Vivian screamed, flew backward, hit the wall, and slid to the ground, unable to get up for a long time. Ryan's chest heaved violently, he tightened his arms around me, as if wanting to merge me into his bones and blood. Ariana, don't be afraid, I'm here. His voice sounded above my head, carrying heavy trembling and lingering fear. I leaned in his embrace, smelling his familiar cedar scent, but my body was cold as ice. Afraid? What do I have to fear? The ones who should be afraid are you. This good show has just begun. Vivian was driven away by Ryan. Or rather, escorted out by Ryan's bodyguards. When she left, her eyes were like poison knives, glaring at me fiercely, as if wanting to devour me alive. Ryan didn't glance at her again. He called the family doctor to give me a comprehensive physical examination, and only after confirming I was just frightened with no major issues did he finally relax. He sat by my bed all night without sleep. At dawn, his eyes were bloodshot, his chin covered in blue stubble, looking exhausted and haggard. He held my hand, apologizing repeatedly. Ariana, I'm sorry, it's all my fault. I shouldn't have deceived you, shouldn't have treated you as a vessel. I admit, at first, I approached you with impure motives. But over 3 years, Ariana, I truly... He didn't continue. But I knew what he wanted to say. He wanted to say he truly fell in love with me. How laughable. A man who could schemingly nurture a heart vessel for his first love now came to tell me he loved me. His love was as cheap as roadside garbage. I withdrew my hand and looked at him calmly. Ryan, let's talk. This was the first time since the incident that I clearly spoke to him. He was stunned for a moment, then joy burst in his eyes. Okay, Ariana, speak, I'm listening. First, I want a face-to-face confrontation with Vivian. Ryan's face stiffened. Ariana, her emotions are very unstable, it's not suitable now. Then wait until she's suitable. I interrupted him. Ryan, this matter is non-negotiable. My attitude was firm. He looked at me and finally compromised. Okay, I'll arrange it. Second, I paused, stating my ultimate goal. I want you to tell the entire truth from 3 years ago, exactly as it was, to everyone in the Zhou and Bai families. Ryan's pupils contracted sharply. Ariana, are you crazy? He stood up abruptly, unable to believe his ears. If the truth gets out, do you know the consequences? The Zhou and Bai families will be ruined. My dad's company will go bankrupt, I'll be cursed behind my back for life. Vivian will be driven to death by public opinion. Isn't that what you want? I countered. He was stunned. I looked at him and said clearly, word by word, Ryan, I jumped, pulled the tube, self-harmed, not to gain your sympathy, nor to threaten you. I just want all of you to know that what you owe me is more than just a sorry. You owe me a life. My voice was light, yet it struck Ryan's heart like a heavy hammer. He staggered back 2 steps, his face pale, lips moving but unable to utter a word. He finally understood. I wasn't throwing a tantrum or playing tricks. I truly wanted all their lives. Using my own life to exchange for their destruction. Ariana. He spoke with difficulty, his voice hoarsely unnatural. Does it have to be this way? Between us, is there really no other possibility? Looking at his pained expression, my heart was without ripples. There is. I gave him a brilliant yet incredibly cruel smile. Unless you go right now and dig out Vivian's heart and give it back to me. Ryan was scared out of his wits by my words. He looked at me, his eyes full of fear, as if seeing a demon crawling out of hell. You're a lunatic. He threw down these words and fled my room in embarrassment. Watching his fleeing back, the smile on my lips deepened. Lunatic? Yes, I am a lunatic. One they personally drove mad. In the following days, Ryan didn't appear again. I enjoyed the peace, cooperating with the doctor's treatment every day, eating and sleeping on time. My body recovered quickly. The burn on my arm began to scab slowly under the effect of expensive medications, but it left ugly scars. A week later, I reached out to Ryan. Have you set the time and place for the confrontation? There was a long silence on the other end before a weary voice replied, It's set. Tomorrow at 10 in the morning, at the Zhou family's old residence. All right. I hung up without further ado. The next day, Ryan's driver picked me up on time. The car drove steadily to the suburban Zhou family old residence. It was a solemn and dignified Chinese-style courtyard, also the power center of the Zhou family. In my previous life, I had only come once during the engagement, so nervous I didn't know where to put my hands and feet. But this time I held my head high, like a queen about to step onto the battlefield. The living room was full of people, Ryan's parents, Vivian's parents, and several Zhou family uncles and elders. Everyone had solemn expressions. Vivian sat beside her mother, her face pale, eyes swollen. Seeing me enter, her body trembled uncontrollably. Ryan stood beside his father Charles, head lowered, expression unclear. I walked to the center of the living room, sat on the reserved single sofa, and calmly scanned the room. Everyone's here, let's begin. My opening remark stunned everyone present. They probably didn't expect me, the victim, to be so assertive. Charles, a man over 50 yet still imposing, spoke first. His voice was deep and authoritative. Miss Ariana, we invited you today to solve the problem, not to escalate conflicts. Solve the problem? I laughed. Charles, how do you think a life can be solved? His face darkened. Ryan has told us the ins and outs. It's our Zhou family that has wronged you. Whatever compensation you want, feel free to ask. Compensation? I acted as if I heard the biggest joke. Charles, do you think I lack money? I've been with Ryan for 3 years, what he gave me is enough to squander for several lifetimes. Then what do you want? I put away my smile, my gaze piercing as I looked at him. I want you all ruined and disgraced. Insolent. Charles slammed the table angrily. Ariana, don't push your luck. If things really blow up, what benefit is there for you? The benefit is, I stood up, walking step by step to Vivian, looking down at her condescendingly, if I'm not well, none of you will be well. Vivian shrank back in fear from my aura. Her mother immediately shielded her, shrieking, What do you want? Let me tell you, Ariana, our Bai family is not to be trifled with. Is that so? I chuckled lightly, taking something from my bag. It was a voice recorder. I pressed play. Ryan's familiar and cruel voice clearly echoed throughout the living room. Vivian, you've got one thing wrong. From beginning to end, Ariana was never your substitute. 3 years ago, I needed a heart source, a healthy one that matched me, to save your life. And Ariana was the most perfect vessel I found. After the recording finished, the entire living room was deathly silent. Everyone's gazes focused on Ryan and Vivian, filled with shock, contempt, and disbelief. Charles's face was as black as the bottom of a pot. He turned sharply and kicked Ryan in the back of the knee, forcing him to kneel with a thud. Unfilial son. You unfilial son. Charles trembled with anger, pointing at Ryan's nose and cursing, How did I give birth to such a conscienceless thing? You could do something like this. Vivian's parents' faces were extremely ugly. They looked at their daughter with deep disappointment and shame in their eyes. Vivian, is what he said true? You were involved too? Grace asked with a trembling voice. Vivian's lips trembled, unable to say a word. Her silence was the best answer. Slap. Henry slapped her, harder than Ryan's. You've disgraced the Bai family completely. For a moment, the living room was filled with Elder's angry curses and Junior's cries. I watched this farce coldly, without any ripples in my heart. When they had made enough noise, I slowly spoke. I have many backups of this recording. One is with a friend I absolutely trust. If anything happens to me, he'll immediately give the recording to the media. My words were like a bucket of cold water, extinguishing everyone's anger. They all turned to me, their eyes full of wariness. What exactly do you want? Charles asked through gritted teeth. My demand has never changed. I looked at Ryan kneeling on the ground and said word by word, I want him to hold a press conference and make all the truth public. Impossible. Charles rejected without thinking. The Zhou family's reputation must not be ruined by him. Is that so? I shook the recorder in my hand. Then we'll see in court. Intentional injury, trafficking in human organs, I think these charges combined are enough for young Master Ryan to spend a lifetime in prison. You. Charles was so angry he couldn't speak. At this moment, the silent Ryan finally raised his head. He looked at me with complex emotions I couldn't understand. Okay, he said hoarsely, I agree. Everyone was stunned, including me. I didn't expect him to agree so readily. Ryan. Are you crazy? Charles roared. Dad, Ryan stood up, looking at him calmly, this is what I owe her. It's time to repay. He turned to me, giving me a deep look. Ariana, I'll hold the press conference. But before that, can you give me a little more time? What are you going to do? I asked warily. I need to go to a place to get something. He didn't specify. When I return, I'll give you a true account. His gaze was too candid, too sorrowful. As if possessed, I nodded. Ryan left the Zhou family old residence. No one knew where he went. 3 days later, just as I thought he was going to break his word, my friend, the hacker who kept the recorder for me, suddenly called me. His voice was filled with unprecedented shock and panic. Ariana. Quick, watch the news. Something big happened. My heart skipped a beat, and I immediately turned on the TV. The local news channel was broadcasting an urgent news. It is reported that Ryan, president of the Zhou Group, underwent euthanasia at a Swiss euthanasia institution this morning. He left a suicide note, stating his willingness to donate all personal organs, among which his heart will be directed to a lady named Ariana. On the TV screen was Ryan's pale and peaceful sleeping face. He wore a white suit, lying on a white bed, like a sleeping prince. My mind went blank. The remote in my hand fell to the ground with a clack. Ryan was dead. He ended his life in a way I completely hadn't anticipated. He didn't hold a press conference, didn't ruin the Zhou family. He chose to use his own life to repay the owed life to me. Using that heart which once schemed against me for Vivian to give me a true account. This ending was more intense and cruel than any revenge I imagined. He died, taking all sins, guilt, love, and hate with him. Yet he left me alone in this empty world, bearing the heavy shackles he exchanged with his life. Ryan, how ruthless you are. You won. Ryan's death caused a huge uproar in high society. The Zhou Group's stock plummeted, teetering on collapse. Charles turned white-haired overnight and was urgently hospitalized. The Bai family also completely collapsed. The moment Vivian learned of Ryan's death, she went completely mad. Dressed in red, she ran to Ryan's grave, crying heartbrokenly, then laughing and laughing, she used a fruit knife to slit her wrists. She was rescued, but became demented, every day just hugging a pillow, murmuring Ryan's name. Everyone said I was the only winner in this tragedy. I ruined the Zhou family, drove Vivian mad, obtained the heart donation qualification Ryan exchanged with his life. But only I knew I lost utterly. I didn't accept that heart. My attending physician Collins, a gentle and refined man, found me after learning my decision. Miss Ariana, your heart condition is actually not optimistic. Years of palpitations and premature beats have caused irreversible damage. If you don't undergo transplantation, your life may have less than 5 years left. He looked at me with a hint of inquiry in his eyes. Mr. Ryan's death is a tragedy. But the opportunity he exchanged with his life for you, do you really want to give it up? I looked out the window. The sky was overcast, like my current mood. Dr. Collins, I said softly, what's the difference between a person living on someone else's heart and a walking corpse? In my previous life, my heart was taken. In this life, I don't want to live bearing another person's heart. No matter whose. Collins was silent. He probably understood my obsession. I respect your decision. He sighed. But Miss Ariana, life is precious. Even if not for others, please live well for yourself. I didn't answer. After discharge, I disposed of all the assets Ryan left me, donating them anonymously to charities. Then, I bought a ticket to the south and left this city where I had loved, hated, and despaired. I found a small town by the sea, rented a cottage, and every day watched the tides rise and fall, clouds roll and unfurl. The burn on my arm left an ugly scar. I didn't get scar removal surgery, I let it stay. Like a medal, constantly reminding me of that mad and tragic past. Sometimes, in midnight dreams, I would see Ryan. He stood in a white light, looking at me with sad and gentle eyes. He asked me, Ariana, do you regret it? I don't know. I only know that my heart still aches occasionally. I don't know if it's due to pathological damage or something else. 5 years later. Collins's prophecy came true. My body worsened day by day. On a sunny afternoon, I sat in the rocking chair in the yard, looking at the sparkling sea in the distance, feeling life slipping away. In the last moment of blurred consciousness, I seemed to see Ryan again. He reached out to me, smiling, Ariana, I've come to pick you up. I smiled. This time, I didn't refuse. Ryan, Vivian. What you owed me in the previous life, you've repaid with your lives in this one. Our grievances are settled. If there's a next life, I hope we never meet again.